Well, this is geography lecture number 4 on Russia. I think that the map I tried to show you before did come out a kind of mirror image. Everything was backwards, I suspect, on your video. So you really need to have a map of Europe in front of you, a map of the world around to look at to make sense of these things. That if you're going to see me, apparently it means everything else is backwards. So it doesn't bother so much with a human face, but yeah, it's a problem when you're looking at a map. Everything's backwards. But in any event, Russia is the world's largest country in land area by far. Canada is the second biggest in land area. Neither of them are densely populated. Russia's European portion has sections that are fairly densely populated, but Russia includes a vast area in Asia that is very lightly populated. So the reason Russia is the biggest country in the world in land area, not in population, I think it has something like a little less than half the population of the United States, but it is enormous in land area. It has a very large chunk of Eastern Europe. The biggest nation in Eastern Europe is Russia. But then it spans the Asian portion of the Eurasian landmass all the way to the Pacific Ocean and fills the better part of half of that. So it is a gigantic nation that stretches from the borders of Poland and the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Japan. One country that spans that enormous thing. I believe there are 13 time zones inside Russia. It is enormous. The capital of Russia is Moscow, which is one of the great cities of the world. It also has a commercial hub at St. Petersburg, which is on the Baltic Sea. So, you know where those Baltic states were? Well, they are right below St. Petersburg on the Baltic Sea. So Russia has these two great cities. It has other large cities as well, but the two great cities of Russia are Moscow and St. Petersburg. Now, Moscow is a very ancient city, and it's sort of the cultural heartland of the great Russian people. St. Petersburg is a relatively new city. It was built by the Tsar Peter the Great in the late 1600s and early 1700s. So it's a very Enlightenment city. It was built sort of half modeled on Venice with canals, but it was put on the Baltic Sea as Russia's doorway to Europe, especially to Germany and Holland and even England and France. So St. Petersburg was actually turned into the capital. Peter the Great didn't like being buried deep inside Russia in Moscow. So he moved his capital to his brand new city, which is named after St. Peter, technically, but really is named after Peter the Great, right? This great Western style combination of Paris and Berlin and Venice. It's a Russian city, but it's on the Baltic. It's just a little neck of Russia that sticks out to the Baltic there so that Peter could have his great city. But that was the capital of Russia from the 1710s to 1918 when the Bolsheviks seized power, when the communists seized power. You'll remember we talked about the October Revolution of 1917 and the formation of the Soviet Union. Just after that, they moved the capital back to Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union, and it still is the capital of Russia again today. But St. Petersburg is still a very important commercial city and cultural city. All right. So Russia, the vast majority of people who live in Russia are an ethnic group called the Great Russians. Now, there are other kinds of Russians. That's why they're called the Great Russians. There are Belarusians, or sometimes called White Russians. Those people live to the west of the heartland of the Great Russians. Belarus is their country today. But Russia, as I said, is a vast country. And there are lots of ethnic minorities within it. Some of them are a little like our American Indians in the United States. Out in the Asian portion of Russia, which is called Siberia, I'm sure you've heard the word Siberia since you were small children. Siberia is Asian Russia. It's the part of Russia in Asia. The dividing line between Asia and Europe, you remember, is just a mountain range. It's the Ural mountain range that runs cuts Russia in like 1/3, 2/3 pieces, north-south. And so all you got to do is go over these mountains. And they're not enormous mountains. These are not the Rockies or the Himalayas or something. These are kind of like the Appalachian Mountains. They're fairly easy to get over. So, Russia has no trouble negotiating Europe, Asia this way. But there are Asian peoples inside the Russian state, ethnic groups, tiny ethnic groups. They have their own they're called autonomous republics. They're kind of like Indian reservations for us. And then down in the south of Russia, there are lands where the people aren't ethnic Russians, they're ethnic Turks of various kinds, and they're Muslim. Now, most Russians are not Muslim. Don't get me wrong. The vast majority of Russians, the overwhelming majority of great Russians ethnically, are Eastern Orthodox people. They are Christians of the Eastern Orthodox variety. As are, say, the Greeks and the Bulgarians and many Romanians. But the Russian Orthodox Church is a Christian church, and the majority of great Russians are members of that Christian denomination. But there are these minorities in the south that are Muslim. There are these minorities in the Siberia that are basically animists. They still have shaman, things like that. But culturally, the Slavic people that are the great Russian people are Christian, deeply Christian in the Russian Orthodox tradition. So deeply Christian where you remember when we talked about communism is supposed to be atheistic. Karl Marx said religion was the opiate of the masses. Religion is used by the capitalists to drug the workers, so to speak, so they don't care how badly they have it in this life because they're waiting for heaven. So Karl Marx dismissed religion. And the Bolsheviks, when they seized power, the communists, when they seized power, tried to basically destroy Christianity in Russia. And they did. They closed churches. They imprisoned the clergy. They forbade people to publicly talk about Christianity almost entirely. They allowed a few little churches here and there to stay open, but they observed everybody who went in and out. They wanted to destroy religion if they could. But they didn't want the world to see them as harsh repressors, so they allowed a little, almost showpiece Christianity to go on here and there. But the number of priests dropped to virtually nothing over the course of Stalin's reign until World War I. I think there were like a dozen priests in all of the vast city of Moscow in 1941. So Christianity, they did their best to wipe it out. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, when it was possible to go to church and not worry about the KGB watching you, the churches of Russia began to fill again. They began to restore the old dilapidated buildings. Men went into the priesthood in enormous numbers. And now Russia is one, if not the most, church-attending country in all of Europe. So 70 years of communism did not do the job to destroy Russian Christianity. I can't help. I got to tell you one anecdote on this. It is said that Stalin in the 1930s was on a kick to destroy Christianity in the Soviet Union. And he sent around these teams of experts who were supposed to talk to the common people and talk them out of Christianity, tell them what a ridiculous thing it was and all this. And there were supposedly a group of Russian peasants that were in a sort of soccer stadium listening to a communist official haranguing them for an hour and a half, telling them how the church had cheated them of their lands and their money and how it was worthless and it was all ridiculous and no scientific thinking person could believe in Christianity. Went on and on and on about how ridiculous Christianity was. And they had brought out this old monk, practically the only clergyman they could find still alive. They've done their best to wipe them out. This old monk, he's barely can walk. He's toothless. He's got this long, scraggly gray beard. You can imagine. He's been through the ringer. But they trot him out, so it's kind of a debate to show this foolish old man versus their scientific communist apologists. And it is said that after an hour and a half or so of being harangued by the communist anti-religion specialist, they gave the microphone to the old man, so, to show how weak his case was. And they said the old man got up to the mic and he didn't give a defense at all. He simply shouted out the Easter acclamation to the crowd, which is, "Alleluia, Christ is risen." And the congregation, the whole crowd shouted back the response, "The Lord is risen indeed. Alleluia." And the meeting was broken up. I hope that story is true. I don't know if it's literally true. But what it does reflect is the communists could not kill Christianity. They could shut the churches, they could shoot the priests, but they couldn't kill it. And Christianity came roaring back with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's very important in Vladimir Putin's Russia today. So I mentioned Vladimir Putin. So we should talk about Russian politics today. So the Soviet Union, the Russia was the majority of the Soviet Union, the majority of its population, the majority of its area. So much so that many Americans just said the Russians rather than the Soviets. Although sometimes their leaders, Stalin wasn't a Russian, he was an ethnic Georgian. There were high-ranking Ukrainians in the government, but most people just thought Soviet Union equals Russia. Because about 80%, 79, something like that, percent of the people in the Soviet Union were Russians. So in the Soviet era, they had communist domination, but then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 set Russia free as well. The other states declared their independence, and Russia declared its independence from the Soviet Union, and Russia's been on its own ever since. But an awful lot of Russians missed some things about the good old days. Back when Russia pretty much called all the shots in the Soviet Union, it was kind of like still having the old Russian Empire. And there have always been Russians since 1991 who kind of would like to have things back the way they were, where Russia calls the shots for a good part of Eurasia. And you could say that their present president, Vladimir Putin, is very much in that mold. He was a communist official in the KGB. Then he was mayor of St. Petersburg. Then it was called Leningrad in the communist days. And it's clear that he thinks a lot of the old days when Russia ran a lot of countries around them. So much so that, well, you probably saw a couple of years ago, most people would say that he sent troops into the Crimea to seize it. Technically, he claims they were volunteers going down to help the ethnic Russians being so terribly abused by the Ukrainians. The rest of the world doesn't buy any of this. And then Russian troops, too, went into the eastern part of Ukraine and have been trying to break it off, and essentially have broken it off. It's called the Donbass region of Ukraine. He's basically trying to build Russia up by seizing portions of its neighbors and overawing the others to do what they're told. That's how an awful lot of people, me included, see Vladimir Putin's international actions. But Putin is also a strong man like the old czars. Technically, they have elections in Russia, but the state media controls the vast majority of television and radio. The government that Putin runs the television networks, the radio stations, and most of the major newspapers. And the ones that aren't technically run by the government are run by what are called the oligarchs, very rich people that Putin helps to stay rich. So they're his friends, his wealthy friends who own what's not officially controlled by the government. So if all the news media you get, or almost all the news media you get, says nothing but glowing things about Vladimir Putin, do you think it's going to be hard for him to win the elections? No, it's easy. He's a popular figure, but he doesn't really have a news media out there who's going to criticize him. Our presidents, none of them ever like being criticized by our news media. They almost always complain about it, but at least we know that there are going to be people who will tell us things that the presidents don't like here. So we've at least got to make up our own mind about whether we believe what we believe. In Russia, it's almost always good news about Vladimir Putin. He is always smart and on top of everything. And yeah, they still have elections, but it's very hard to get on the ballot to run against Putin or one of his people in his party that support him. Very hard to even get on the ballot. And if you do, the news media is going to be 100% on their side, pretty much. So while they have elections, Vladimir Putin and his associates win them overwhelmingly. But he probably is also popular. I mean, the people hear nothing but good things about him, so why wouldn't they like him, right? Maybe I'm being a little cynical, but that's the way it looks to me. I think Vladimir Putin is a strong man and authoritarian ruler. In any event, we'll continue with Russia. It's such an important country in our next lecture.